and welcome to our lecture on Impressionism. However, before we go into Impressionism, let's go back a century and talk about some of the previous styles that we've studied, beginning with Fragonard's The Swing with Rococo. So remember, the Rococo period is all about the aristocracy, these frivolous scenes of carefree activities, love, romance. There's these light brushstrokes and looser brushstrokes. The color palette is pastel and lighter. And then we have a reaction against that with the neoclassical. And the neoclassical is very Greco-Roman. This is where history painting is really established as being the top of the hierarchy with painting by the Academy and the salons. Yeah, very precise brushstrokes defined. And then we have a Romanticism, where this is extremely subjective, where it's meant to be emotionally expressive, where it's meant to be extremely dramatic. It's often about the emotion or the man versus nature and the dramatic nature scenes around you or around these epic history scenes. It's also somewhat anti-heroic. We don't have the heroism of the Hirashi brothers of the neoclassical. And so the emphasis is on emotion, that feelings and intuition is more important than reason. Individual freedoms are more important, thought, religion, painting, etc. And these are much more subjective depictions based on feelings. But there's also the power of nature, the heroic power of nature, that we human beings are just tiny specks by comparison. And so we have this darker color palette as well. A little bit of looser brush strokes, but the faces are extremely expressive. And then a reaction, and here's another example of, again, this powerful, dramatic nature that we are little, and as well as the commentary on the evils of humanity that are going on. And then we have realism with our stonebreakers, think Courbet. And there's this focus on everyday life. Where now we're not trying to be dramatic and emotional. Instead, we're focusing on everyday figures, on the poor, a subject matter which had never been explored in art, or at least on the forefront, such as this one. The color palette has changed. We have different forms of brushstrokes. We have these contour lines often. So this challenges every notion about high art, in which many people claim this is the beginning of modernism. Very avant-garde. It challenges the norm, the status quo. I should also mention that the realists, so this is a time period in which groups of people are creating these manifestos where they declare these new thoughts. I think of like the Communist Manifesto and all these other ones. Many of the art groups that we'll study also have their own manifestos, like the Realist Manifesto, where they lay out and define what their purpose is and what realist art is. And so we have Edouard Manet with an A, Luncheon on the Grass, in which he's blatantly challenging the norms. This artwork is rejected by the salon, and so he and others basically have a salon of rejects, and this is so much more popular than the official salon. And he challenges these notions of the subject matter. He has a lighter color palette. He has all these gentlemen in contemporary clothing. She was in contemporary clothing. We're not trying to depict a goddess here versus all the nude Venuses that were everywhere, Aphrodites by the other artists. So we're moving more into the second half of the century. And this is where we're going to see a lot of reactions to industrialization. Numerous artists, as industrialization was really making a mark on society and was increasing, they're reacting to, like with the Communist Manifesto, the oppression of people. But by the second half of the 19th century, there's this shift where you start to realize that many people who were originally poor are able to become involved with these industries, and they start to move up. And so you watched this video yesterday about this huge shift of abject poverty decreasing, which means that we have an extremely big increase in the middle class. And this changes everything. So you have a lot of people who before were poor and they're moving up in society socioeconomically. And this leads to more freedom. This leads to more free time. And this leads more to the patronage of art. Anytime that we see more art styles coming about, more art produced, this is indicative of more people being able to spend money, of more people having free time, etc. And so we see that here. This is really the beginning of modernism. We see a lot of avant-garde art and a big increase in urbanization. So much of what we'll see is a reaction to the cities becoming so densely populated. But we also have more free time. So aspects of the city will change to accommodate that. Now remember, the invention of photography, of course, changed everything. Many of these styles aim to create a realistic image with paint on a two-dimensional surface, and now that is achieved with photography. So artists are changing their goals and trying to figure out other ways of how they want to depict anything on a canvas. And there's Olympia, again bringing characteristics of Parisian life, such as prostitutes, to fine art. Now, things are changing, and as part of a reaction to this urbanization in France, we have Napoleon III. Yes, he's related. He becomes president. Things calm down politically. By the 1870s, we have this really time of prosperity, really, that began. But anyway, so Napoleon III, before that, he hires Baron Haussmann, an architect, to redesign the city of Paris. So here's what much of Paris looked like in the 1850s. We have these very narrow streets. If you go to different parts of Italy, this looks pretty much the same. But Napoleon and Baron Haussmann decide to change the city, that they need to accommodate this increasing population, that these quarters are much too close and crowded and cramped, and this can only lead to disaster in numerous ways, from disease to imagine a fire breaking out, etc. And with revolutionary or attempts at revolution from the 1830s to 48, and where people would riot and blockade. And so one of the issues is that they were able to create these blockades in these very narrow streets. And so, as a reaction to that, the leader decides we shouldn't have narrow streets anymore, so that people can't rise up. And so here we have where the old buildings are torn down and where the streets are widened. We see the difference here. And this becomes the model for the city of Paris as we know today. So not only is it, of course, for the political reasons, but also it's to introduce air and light, to connect the city, to make this more accommodating to the huge population boom that's occurring. And so here's our modern day city of Paris, and look how orderly and designed, organized it is. And also, what do we notice? Greenery, right? These trees along the boulevards, and we'll talk about the parks. Here's an aerial view today, and depictions of when this change was initially made. So here's today's Paris. Here's the Seine River, which cuts through the middle of Paris. Walkways on either side. And there's a reason why it's so popular. Just beautiful. And parks are made. So now we have more free time. And the working class has more free time. The emerging middle class has more free time. And so to enjoy that, especially when you're starting to live in this densely populated city without trees, there's a reaction where people want these trees, where they want nature. Many people had the same concerns that we have today of the negative effects of industrialization on the environment, on nature, and the loss of it. Those concerns were voiced just as equally by people of this time period. So parks are built to accommodate that human need to be out in nature. And there are many across the city of Paris. It's really neat. And of course, we have to introduce Paris cafes. They're so different than anywhere else. I love them. You can any cafe, many of them are small. They go back to this time period, and you can sit inside or outside and just even have like a coffee and chat. and stay a while. I've been to Paris 3 times. Yeah, 3 times. And they're just lovely. They're so Parisian. But it's at these Paris cafes where we have many of these ideas coming about, many of these artists who are creating these manifestos and are deciding to challenge the norms of art, are deciding how to change the world in their own way, of how to draw attention to people that haven't been recognized before, such as our Realism artists. And we'll look at how the Impressionists change as well and challenge the norms. These Parisian cafes. And these artists are spending time in these cafes, so we have many, many artworks within them. Okay, so Impressionism. Many argue that this is the beginning of modern art. Very avant-garde. Some terms to note, flaneur. So this is also really important. It's like a stroller observer. And this is essentially someone who's just walking around Paris and people watching. It always makes me think of when we would travel and we would have these long 4-hour layovers in airports. And I remember my mom just sitting there and just looking. Like, what are you looking at? And she'd say, oh, I'm just people watching. Like it was an activity. And so this is similar. You're just walking around and you're observing. You're just people watching. And so we see our artists doing that, and we see depictions of that. We also have the concept of in plein air, which is all because of the invention of portable paint tubes. So before, if you were going to paint something, you were mixing up the pigment. It would dry quickly. You're not able to bring it somewhere else. And so all paintings are done in studios. In fact, all the previous landscapes that we looked up until the Impressionists, were done back in the studios. They may have sketched outside, but essentially every landscape before the Impressionists, before the invention of portable paint tubes, was all done mostly by the imagination of the artists. So now we're going to see landscape paintings out in nature for the first time. And thanks to one aspect of industrialization and of inventions and of streamlining things and making life easier for more free time, here's the invention of portable paint tubes, which allows these artists to go out into nature and depict what they're seeing. The first Impressionist exhibition took place in 1874. It came to America in 1886 with James Seton. Paul Durand was really pretty much the investor for the Impressionists. He helped fund them, hoping to change the art world. During his time period, it wasn't economically profitable. It took a while after most of their deaths, for Impressionism to really become extremely popular. And much of that was actually after it came to America. We Americans really, really liked Impressionism. It was so different. Yeah. Now, we're going to look at another artist, Monet. This gets confusing. There's Manet, who we've already seen, and Monet. Manet with the A is first. Okay, he's what we've studied already. So just think Manet with the A was our first guy in realism. And he becomes the mentor to our Impressionists. Okay, so here's Gustave Caillebois. Paris Street, Rainy Day, 1877. So he's technically Impressionism, but his brushstrokes are a little bit different. All of them have their own style of brushstrokes. But we do see a little bit of looser brushstrokes. But he's obviously extremely talented. These artists are able to depict realistic images. But again, with the invention of photography, that's been done now. So here's our depiction of the city. But here's a good example of our flaneur, of where we, the viewer, are just walking around the streets of Paris, where these other individuals are looking around. But also, this is an example of how, like when you're in a big city, you may be surrounded by people, but you feel lonelier. You're not interacting with one another. There is this sense of loneliness. You're not, even though it's so crowded. It's different. I think of like when I went to, my sister lives in New York City. She's a fashion designer up there. And the last time that I visited her, I was walking around while she was at work. And out of habit, I a couple times gave my Texas smile to people. And then was getting major cat calls and practically harassed or ran away. You know, so it's so different in cities. You're not being friendly with all these people and interacting with people. And so there's a reaction to that as well. And again, everyone has more free time now. And so within these parks, there's areas, many, many parks in Paris. And so you have these random get-togethers. And here's the dance at the Moulin de la Gatte at this outdoor park. You can see the cafe back there. It's crowded. So I don't want to emphasize just the negative aspect. Last year when I taught Impressionism, I had a student say, this is somewhat depressing. And I was like, I've done Impressionism wrong. I'll focus more on the positive next year. And so we have an emphasis on the social activities that are going on that really, for the first time in history of people having so much more free time to get together and to have these activities. Now, again, we have this emerging middle class. We also have the nouveau rich, where all these people are suddenly rich for the first time. It's not old money, it's new money. And this creates conflict in the upper classes. There's always human nature has conflict. Anyone, family that has never battled with one another, had an argument, and I believe in world peace, but otherwise we're plagued with conflict. But here we are outside. These people are enjoying themselves. And so let's notice the brushstrokes here and how these quick, spontaneous brushstrokes are so different than the previous styles that we've looked at. And also, let's appreciate how much he's really observed this situation. And I want you to think of the leaves that are behind us where we're standing as the viewers, and how he has depicted the way how sunlight, streams through these leaves, right? We can imagine the leaves somewhat swaying and the shadows are somewhat moving, and look at how he depicts this. You can really only do this with Impressionism, with these quick, spontaneous brushstrokes. Notice that the color palette has changed. It's become lighter. And so there's this real emphasis on light and color. So when you think Impressionism, I want you to think light and color. So now we don't need to create super realistic art because that can be done with photography. So what's a new thing that we can do as artists? We can study how light changes, how light affects what we're looking at. And so essentially much of the Impressionism movement is a study of light and color and how light changes. So consider the light streaming through these leaves and the light on these people and the sense of color. And the name actually comes from Claude Monet with an O. It's Impressionism Sunrise. And so he created this artwork, and it's one of several. They would have these series. And again, you have the invention of tube paint. So you're out there, you have a couple of easels and canvas set up. And so you're painting, you come up bright early in the morning for the sunrise. And so you're painting what you see in the sunrise. And you're really focusing on how light and color interact and how this changes through the day. Because then once you get midday, the light has changed. The colors look different because of that light. And so you'd move on to your next canvas and you would paint what it looks like at midday, and continuing on with afternoon and sunrise. And so here's an example of where he's been studying how light and color change with the sunrise, right? Or excuse me, I mixed that up. We'd be depicting the sunset, but here's our example of the sunrise. And this also, remember, we're coming out of the Realism movement. We're pulling aspects of that. It changed art as we know it. And so they too are the Impressionists are also focusing on the present, the everyday, and on the single moment in time. But we aren't trying to create anything epic or dramatic. We're just depicting what is. So it's not like Romanticism. We looked at landscapes that are focused on nature for Romanticism, but there isn't a sense of drama with this one. It's not really man versus nature. Instead, these loose, spontaneous brushstrokes enable the artist to really attempt to depict how light and color changes. It's like this study in optics. The red of the sun as the sun rises is reflected on the water and mimicked in the sky behind it. They're looking at how color changes in response to light. how to convey this sense of atmosphere. Essentially, subject matter isn't as important as what the eye sees. In fact, the subject matter here is more about the atmosphere of light and color. And this one was rejected from the salon, like other avant-garde artists who challenged the norms. But yeah, the portable paint tubes enable them to do this. Paint's cheaper as well. It's much cheaper. It's more accessible. It's these synthetic pigments, which allows them to be in tube form. And it allows people to slather on paint, to go into nature, to really capture this spontaneity, to have lots of paint to be able to do so. Again, this focus on light and color, these spontaneous brush strokes, they're quick. And consider how even much of this is about the atmosphere. Here's Manet again, our first guy who we saw with Realism. And here we are, a bar at the Folies Bergère. So we have our cafe bar. Many people are there. They would have entertainment at many of these. In fact, up here is you can see the feet of our trapeze artist, entertaining the people. But come back to how he started with realism, but how his color palette has changed, how it's become lighter. His brush strokes seem a little more spontaneous. You could argue each of these little areas are a still life. So remember, he's, even with his earlier art with the Luncheon on the Grass, with our Olympia, where he's playing on this subject matter. Before the female nude was depicted, but it's a goddess form. Well, he's going to depict it and make it explicit it's not a goddess form. He's going to depict it and make it explicit that she is a prostitute, in which Parisian upper class males would often go to. Here you could argue little cutouts of this are still lifes. And so he's capturing this moment, and he's also capturing the working class, this barmaid here. And he's playing with optics and how we view things. So much so that he almost rejects a realistic approach to a reflection. So you may initially think, this is a bar and we're looking at either sides, but then you're like, no, this is a mirror. We see the back of the glasses. Here she is. But wait, if it was her mirror image, it would be right behind her. Is she leaning forward right now or before to speak to this gentleman, to ask what he'd like to order? And he's doing this purposefully. He's playing, showing off with the fact that you don't have to create a completely realistic image. You don't have to show the reflection right behind the person with accuracy. He's focusing on the light of the atmosphere, the light and color of the atmosphere. I do want to point out, I had a professor in grad school and how we see this same bracelet as our Olympia that he uses. But anyway, so they're rejecting the norms. They're challenging the salon and the academy, and they've been rejected by them, and so they hold their own exhibitions. Right, versus an Olympia. You see the bracelet? Put it on the grass. Now, we should also note that this is when we studied our East Asia unit and how these Japanese prints traveled into Europe and just became so popular, like wildfire. Japan had just opened up for trade in 1963. And so almost immediately, all these prints, these exotic prints, make their way into Paris, where they really thrive. And it creates this whole fad called Japonism. Even when we studied colonial art in Mexico, remember with the folding screen, how there were elements from the East there. It was part of this Japonism. And so what's happening is really interesting, because in Paris, we have this increase of the middle class. We have this first time, really, there's time for leisurely activities. There's free time. Well, the same thing has been happening in Japan under the Edo period. And so they're depicting just normal everyday activities where artists can sit and take these images, and depict these images, and where these Japanese artists are out in nature. Not with tube paints yet and creating it, but they're depicting scenes of nature. And so we have that appeal to what's happening in Europe and happening with our Parisians, where they too have this emerging class and these leisurely activities, and they're challenging the norms of art. And so we have this subject matter is extremely appealing. Just everyday life. There may be something epic, or there may not be. Just everyday life. Even again, emerging at just brushing her hair out of the bath. But this is beautiful. Just normal everyday activities. Out strolling around. And so our Impressionists do the same. They are influenced by this Japanese art. 1874, they have their own salon, or their own exhibition, because they've been rejected by the Academy. So Impressionism, it's focusing on how color changes responding to light, how to convey a sense of atmosphere. The subject matter is not important as what the eye sees, and there's a focus on the leisure activities of people. So the Barbizon School of Art is one of these schools that emerge influenced by Impressionism. Came before Impressionism, which they were influenced by. Just a little side note, where they would take these day-long excursions and they'd observe what they were seeing out in nature and the epicness of nature. They were more in the realism. Okay, so here is Monet with an O, our sunrise artist. Here's the Saint Lazare station, where we have these series by Monet. Again, where he would come out and he would paint the same scene on different canvas throughout the day to observe how light so subtly changes everything, how light changes the color. And again, he's really trying to get the impression of this moment. So Impressionism, this impression of this moment, the spontaneity of this present moment, the atmosphere of this present moment. Okay. Here's Edgar Degas. Oh yeah, and also consider how this is illustrating our urbanization, our industrialization here, changing of the city. Left off. So here is Degas. You've likely seen some of his paintings before. He's really well known for these ballet scenes. Now, Degas was one of our shorter-lived Impressionists. In fact, by the late 1880s, he had pretty much retired. He came from a wealthier family, and so he was able to do so. But here are the type of scenes in which he's known for. So it has, let's first acknowledge the brushstrokes here. And there's this real spontaneous quality to it all. Even so much as so where he's not focused on correct perspective or a correct perception of depth here. Look at even like the bend of the floor. He's just trying to capture the impression of this moment. And he's trying to capture the dynamic movement of these ballet dancers. So we can see the quick brushstrokes in his study of these individuals. Ballet dancers during this time period were considered part of the working class. They are the lower rungs of society. And so he's taking this realist notion of bringing lower rungs of society up into high art. So at the time, this was a surprising subject matter. Now let's come back to the composition here and how the perspective is a little bit off, but also it has this very snapshot type quality to it, where, the stairs are cut off, which is jarring to us. We wouldn't think of the stairs being so close to us, the viewer, the edge of the picture plane. We would assume that the focus would mainly be on the dancers, who many are blocked by this staircase. And whereas this young girl who's getting, her dress tied is also cut off. So here's where our influence of Japonisme comes in. Here's some other paintings of the ballet dancers in practice as well as on stage. This was before the creation or the invention of electrical lights. And so originally, when we think of a theater, we think of these spotlights from above and they shine down onto the people on the stage. But before that, we have these gas lanterns, and they were actually on the bottom of the stage, right on the edge between the stage and between the orchestra. And so we can see that here with the light and how the source of light is in the lower right of this scene, and it comes up. So just FYI, that's why many older paintings of any type of stage scene are going to have this dramatic lighting. But here's what he's known for. And so he's using these Japanese print ideas in which you're not focusing on perspective. You're just focusing on these normal genre scenes, and where the Impressionists in general, just like our realists, are challenging the notions of art. They're challenging perspective. They're challenging this balanced composition. Instead, they're trying to create the impression. He's also known, whenever you see any of these women getting into a bath or even charcoal sketches, that's Degas as well. And this is a big Japanese interest. I think I may have misspelled it on the previous slides. It should have an E there, sorry. But anyway, where these prints were coming in. Even these prints were so popular, not only by themselves, but early ceramics, as they were making their way in from Japan, were wrapped in prints of these. And so here we have just these normal women getting ready for the bath or brushing their hair. And so Degas is looking to this subject matter. He also painted scenes in the city of everyday life, and here's one such: absinthe. Absinthe is an alcoholic drink with wormwood mixed into it. It can cause psychosis, hallucinatory aspects. It pretty much became a crisis for a little bit in Paris from people abusing it. And so here we have an absinthe drinker. Now let's compare the color palette. This is much darker than our lighter color palette with some pastel colors. And what he's doing is he's making a commentary on this new society, on this industrialized society, on this urbanization. We're removed from nature, and consider how these individuals are sitting right next to each other, likely a couple, but they aren't interacting. The green color and tone throughout this, from the wallpaper to, of course, her drink, etc., and a little bit in the tables and the floors, in his face and her face, and it gives this very jarring and sickly tone and mood to it all. And that's intentional, as he's trying to show the loneliness of living in these new cities. And we, the viewer, are a part of it. We're sitting here, but we're also blocked from them. Consider this angled perspective that he's created, and how these tables create this isolating, trapping effect. And so he too is commenting on these changes. Let's see. Face, and those Impressionists love mirrors. So here's the rehearsal. Now here is a sculpture by Degas, Little Dancer, age 14, and notice the many forms of media that comprise of this statue. And so he is challenging these statues. I mean, consider the many that we've studied thus far. None of them had other media attached to them. This is made of like the last wax type process. And so he has purposely left the surface somewhat rough. In fact, you'd be able to see his thumbprints into it, where he first created the wax version of this. But then what was so new, well, for this time period, I did this in ancient Greece, and different cultures will dress depictions of gods, etc., of sculptures. But anyway, is where he includes cloth, where he has this ribbon tied around her hair. She has the bodice and the fabric skirt. And so he's challenging the notions of a sculpture. This is not smoothed out. This is not, he hasn't depicted her outfit and the bow as part of the sculpture. Instead, he's added it on. So this multimedia sculpture also helps to open the doors in art. It's challenging this checklist that we've seen in art history. Coming back to Japonism, and I don't want to just end the depiction of the absinthe drinker. And what's really known in Impressionism, when you think of Impressionism, you probably think of one of these versions of either these water lilies or these bridges. And these are by Monet with our O. He pretty much keeps the same type of style throughout the entirety of his career. He goes on to meet many of the next key artists of the next styles, even so much as visiting later on, decades later, Picasso's studio. So he stays in art. Many of our other impressionists by the end of the 1880s had moved away from Impressionism. And so here we have, again, this influence coming in from Japan. In fact, when Monet retired officially, he still continued painting, and he painted at his own gardens. And here he had this Japanese bridge made. But of course, what he's primarily known for are these water lily series, and there's so many. So consider earlier where he was depicting light and where he was focusing on how light changes color at different times of the day. And so he's doing that as well with these water lily series. And so the lily pads, and especially in the East, the lotus flower are really important subject matters. And so it's this idea of these lily pads. Consider different parks in Houston and how we'll see lily pads in these swamp-like areas. And so despite the mud and the muck of the water and the dirt underneath it, that up come these lily pads, and in the East up come these lotus flowers. And despite the fact that they're surrounded by this muck, is that they have this pristine, clean surface on them. And so it's this idea, despite hardships, despite changes, that we too can come through, all right, get through all that mud and in this transformational process. And so we can see the relevancy of why he'd be focusing on these lily pads, these water lilies, so many times throughout his series. Later on, so he actually had trouble with his eyesight later, macular degeneration, where he was losing his eyesight, and he continued to paint these bridges. And you can see where later in his life, where his sight had changed tremendously. Again, he's well known for these beautiful depictions of light and color, and changed the art world. Like I said, visited and was friends with many of the key artists of many of our next styles that come up. And they open up the door for everyone. So along the lines of Japonisme again, let's introduce Marie Cassatt. And here's an example of a print by her, the coiffure. The coiffure is the name of the hairstyle and what she's wearing. Also the ritual of creating that hairstyle. But she's really influenced by these ukiyo woodblock prints. The hair, the back, and just the simple lines, the graceful lines of the neck. Nude, a nude female, but not in any type of sexual manner by any means. And just a depiction of everyday life, of she's just getting her hair ready. There's no epic scene going on here. There's no grand meaning or anything. And she has this pastel color palette. Other artists depict everyday life, and including getting your hair ready. Degas and Marie Cassatt were close friends. She was an American, I should mention. She's an American, and so she moved over to France to get on this new art, and she was introduced to Degas, and they become close friends. And so he helped train her. Remember, she is a female, so this is a time period in which they really aren't embraced in the art world. Not as many opportunities. She ends up moving her whole family here. She did not have kids. I should say so, her husband. But she creates this print series influenced by this Japanese art. Consider how we just studied Degas depicting women getting ready for the bath or coming out of the bath. And so she too is leaning into this subject matter. And she really likes this print series. She said that she wanted to make her art more accessible for the larger audience. She's quoted as saying, "I believe nothing will inspire a taste for art more than the possibility of having it in the home. I should like to feel that amateurs in America could have an example of my work, a print or an etching for a few dollars. That is what they do in France. It is not left to the rich alone to buy art. The people, even the poor, have taste and buy according to their means. And here they can always find something they can afford." However, what she's more known for are these scenes of mothers and children. Here we have, she's also known for her stylistic qualities. All of these Impressionists have different variations, but she still has, particularly in the background, this looser brushstroke, more spontaneous. But she does seem to take a slower time with her brushstrokes on the individuals to give more details to them. Again, she, like Degas, is not concerned in a realistic perspective, but she is focusing on these two individuals. And so it's not that she had this huge interest in these scenes. Well, I mean, she obviously did because she painted them, but she didn't have kids herself. But this was her sphere. We're still in a time period in which women essentially had to have an escort to leave society, or to leave and walk around, or else they would be frowned upon by society. And so she's depicting whom she's hanging out with, other women and their children. And so she paints these scenes. She is also challenging the notions of art, where she is bringing a subject matter that isn't often depicted in a high art setting. And so she's challenging these notions in a different way as well. But I love these sweet little, they're very intimate scenes. And she's recognizable, by the subject matter, but also by the much looser, spontaneous quality of the background versus the more focus on the individuals.